Yeah, I mean, again, the IMF came out with this during the convenient crisis that was COVID, which, by the way, was the biggest bailout. It was a bigger bailout than 2008 in the repo markets and the bond markets, despite the PPL loans and the saving Main Street economy, which barely got a sliver of that money. Most of that money went back into the bond markets. So again, COVID was a great bailout, but in 2020, the IMF had the audacity to come out with this beautiful white paper and little video with nice music in the background saying, COVID, just like 1944, debts hit all-time highs. We have to come together as a world and think about a new Bretton Woods. They called it a new Bretton Woods. And again, I'm an American with a European background, lived most of my life between both countries, educated in Germany and the US. Nobody, and I live in France and work in Switzerland. So I have a perspective that may be a bias. And where I live in this little village in the south of France, there's still people who talk about the Second World War, and there are still monuments to the First World War. But for the IMF to compare COVID to World War II, where I look out my window, I can see the cemeteries in the distance. They're filled with kids, 17, 18-year-old kids from the Second World War and the First World War. 85 million people died in Europe. Cities like Rotterdam, Dresden were destroyed. Cities like Paris were occupied. London, the Blitz. You cannot compare COVID to World War II. It's an insult to history. It's certainly an insult to any of us who have family members who remember that war. It's an insult to this continent. It's like calling Gallipoli a beach party. You're an Australian. Gallipoli wasn't a beach party. And COVID was not grounds for a Bretton Woods 2.0. So they did say, though, because of COVID, we have to have another Bretton Woods 2.0, which means a new currency system. But the problem with our debt levels and the problem with our currencies was there long before COVID. I wrote a book called Rigged to Fail. It came out in 2020, just before COVID. And I already said something's going to give, something's going to break. It was the bond market was stretched too thin. The bond market needed liquidity, but they couldn't just bail out the bond market like they did in 2008. Again, that no one would accept another bailout. And then suddenly COVID came 3 months later, and now they've got the biggest bailout in history. It was a bigger bailout than 2008. The banks got liquidity. The central banks flooded the banks with liquidity. So that was a backdoor bailout again in 2020. So, I think the central banks have already, in the Bank of International Settlements, the IMF, have already telegraphed using COVID as the pretext that because of all these seismic changes, we're going to have to, at some point, have a central bank digital currency with blockchain technology. It won't be Bitcoin. It's not going to be Bitcoin. It'll be the same type of technology or ledgers, but they're just going to digitalize this. And so that will not be orderly, in my opinion. I can't begin to try and explain how that will roll out. It certainly won't get the cooperation of the BRICS or Russia and China. So it'll be a very multipolar seismic shift. It won't be as orderly as 1944 Bretton Woods, when America really had the monetary and authoritarian and even immoral position to do this. It'll be much more chaotic this time. But I think they've already telegraphed this 2 years ago, and that's how they do it. It's like a psyop. You kind of plant the seeds, and then it comes a few years later. And so it's already, I think, inevitable. And the Fed coin is out. The Bank of Japan's talking about it. It'll be very interesting to see how that plays out, but that will be messy and painful for a lot of our financial systems. Again, sounds very dramatic. You can't make this stuff up, though. It's so crazy, and it just, all our heads are in the sand, even my own. I don't want to think about it. I don't even want to be right. Egan and I talk about this all the time. I don't even want to be right about this anymore. It's hard to imagine, but it's already what we just went through during the COVID lockdowns and the insult to human liberties and civil liberties and individual choices and freedom of movement and freedom of press. What we've already been through is scary enough. And that's just chapter 2 and 3 of a much larger book. So, financially, I don't see how this is going to be pretty. Hopefully, human nature and politics gets better, but that's naive, I think. But financially, there's no way out of this. Even a reset, they're going to have to see a lot of pain and austerity through that reset. And the key thing for politicians now is to find someone to blame. That's their main problem. I don't think they're going to save us from a recession by rising rates. That's going to create a recession. It might fight inflation. A recession's deflationary, it's disinflationary. So of course that can, that's like a cure that's worse than a disease. But yeah, you can beat inflation with a global recession. Great. But I think the real way to beat inflation throughout history is to debase your currency and have negative real rates. And that's what Powell's going for. Let's think about it. If you've got inflation that's really closer to 16% and you've got a yield on the 10-year of 4%, that's negative 12% interest. That's a great way to backdoor your way out of debt without the world having to notice it. But who suffers? It's the Main Street, it's the middle class who suffers, because that invisible tax of inflation right now is crushing them. So I think it's really sad, but sadly nothing new.